Well, I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us for Leadership Network's latest webinar entitled 5 Keys for Creating a Culture of Leadership Development. My name is Tim Nations. I serve as one of the directors here at Leadership Network, and I'm excited you've chosen to invest the next 50 or so minutes with us as we talk about leadership development in the church. And because we want to serve you in your church, not only will you get some great content today, but we're also going to be passing along a couple of additional free resources on this topic following the webinar. And so I'll share more details about how you can get those resources at the close of our time today. Also, just as a note, we are recording today's webinar, so everyone who's registered will receive a link to that recording following the webinar. That way you can review the content, you can share it with your team, whatever you need to do in the future. Before we get started, let me cover a couple of housekeeping items with you today. You'll notice on the screen today's agenda. In just a moment, I'll introduce Brent Dolfo, who's going to be leading our webinar. But in addition, let me go over a couple of things, technical things with you. Probably one of the biggest issues with any of these types of webinars is related to audio. And so you'll notice at the top of the screen are your audio settings. So if you have any issues, if you can't hear us very well, just click on audio settings, make some adjustments there. If you run into some issues that maybe you can't that you can't resolve, shout out to us. We'll see if we can help you resolve that. But also next to that is our Q&A. So we are going to be taking your questions and answering those all along during the webinar, and then also taking some at the end. And so the easiest way to do that, and really the only way we're going to be monitoring that, is through our Q&A. And so you can just type in your question there and hit send, and we'll deal with those as we go along through the webinar. So that'll help you kind of get acclimated to the platform here as we get started with things. So leading our webinar today is Leadership Network's own Brent Dolfo. Brent has more than 30 years experience in various ministries in Canada, including Alpha and Crew. And over the past several years, Brent has been working with some of the top churches in North America, and I believe even some churches in Europe, who are doing an outstanding job in developing leaders at all levels. And I don't know of anyone who has greater insight into what leading churches are doing to successfully develop leaders at all levels. Brent continues to oversee our leadership development initiatives at Leadership Network through our Hub Leadership Development Experience. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more later in the webinar. But for now, I'll turn things over to Brent, and he can get us started.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to talk about a passionate subject of mine that I could spend hours talking on, is leadership development. And I often talk about leadership development having two sides of the coin. On one side, you have systems and processes and content, but on the other side of the coin, you have a culture. And as we all know, culture eats systems for breakfast. So if we don't have a great culture, a reproducing culture, a culture that values and rewards leadership development, those systems and processes can't operate at its maximum. And today we're it's great to have with us Steve Hutmacher. Steve is the executive pastor at Cedar Creek Church in Toledo, Ohio. It's one of those churches I talked about that everybody should know about, but many people don't. It was a planted church. It currently has over 8,000 in weekly worship attendance. It's got 5 locations. They've helped plant 10 other churches, and as well as churches overseas. And the amazing thing is they have 100 people kind of on payroll, but 97% of those, or 97 of them, were people they raised up as leaders from their own congregation, which is just amazing. And you see Steve's email address there as well. And so welcome, Steve. And tell us just a little bit about Cedar Creek as we get going.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And hey, thanks Leadership Network for hosting this. This is the topic I love. But a little bit about myself. I spent 11 years with Farmers Insurance Group, and 3 of those as an agent, the rest of those in management. And I moved up to Toledo, Ohio in 1995, January of 1995, to be part of the Northwest Ohio District. And so I met Lee Powell and about 20 others who were in the process of beginning Cedar Creek Church. So myself having a wife and 4 children, we decided to join this particular organization, this church. And so in the fall of 19 '95, we launched Cedar Creek Church. I was still the district manager with Farmers Insurance Group. And so within about a couple of years of launching, the church grew to such a point where it had to make a decision of which career path I was going to be taking. And obviously, I went for the big money, right? Pastoring. And so I resigned my position with Farmers Insurance and joined this group of about 25 of us that started Cedar Creek Church.
Well, Steve, just what made you do that? Like, why did you give up that? I mean, what was it about the vision that really excited you?
Yeah, Brent, my wife asks that all the time, but really, seriously, just the mission of reaching people who are far away from God, because we all know that this life, no matter how successful you are, you're not going to take anything with you, right? But leaving a legacy of changed lives, that's what fired us up. And so I decided to make that transition from kind of the marketplace in the ministry. And plus, Lee is a fellow businessman himself. He was in marketing in Chicago with Sears. And so both of us having kind of a similar business background, that was a huge attraction.
Well, let's move on to some of the things that we're going to talk about today. And I think Cedar Creek is a great case study. Today, we're going to sort of talk about sort of the 5 things that have been key to creating a culture of leadership development for you guys. And the first one is prioritizing staff development, helping them become developer of others. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things is that, a lot of us have different size staff. We have about 100 staff, and some people have 3, 4, or 5 staff just starting out. I think the thing is important is to make sure that those staff realize what their real job is. Their real job is to obviously make sure the week runs well, the weekend services run well, but I really believe God's called all of us to be developers of others. And when you talk about leadership culture, I would say a culture is when everybody gets it, or at least the majority. I wouldn't say that we're quite there yet, but we're moving that direction where most people at our church are really understanding the value of developing others. And so we realize that if I can develop my team, our staff, and help them become more efficient in leading themselves well, during their ministries well, it's going to create more margin for them to be able to invest in other people.
And so, Steve, we have a question that's sort of come in here on this one is oftentimes staff feel like they've been hired to execute a job.
Right.
And how have you helped your staff move to a model where they embrace developing others as a key part of their job, just not executing their job themselves?
I think it's really important that every person should have a job description. Built into that job description should be some kind of multiplying factor. Do your job well, increase your skills, but also pass those skills on to other people. And we've been doing that throughout our history of Cedar Creek.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about how you keep this from falling off the table for people. You've talked about your staff all need to be developing people. How do you make sure there's not mission drift back to just executing and doing?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on really what level these leaders are and staff at our church. Some of them's job is really to develop. We have a lot of task-driven staff as well. For example, we have people in our video and arts and graphics team that crank out amazing work and product every single week, stuck in a small room. And what I do is make sure that I schedule times meeting with each department to encourage them, to shepherd them, and just ask them, hey, who are you building into? Who are you passing on your skill to? Who are you inviting into your space to just learn what you do? So it can't just be assumed. It has to be talked about, but it also should be scheduled as well, where there's regular meetings with these staff.
And you guys have been doing this from the very beginning. So this part of your rhythm of how you work with your staff and how you work as a team. If somebody was just starting out making that shift to try to create a culture where development or multiplication was part of it, you've given us a couple of tips there. Make sure it's in the job description. Make sure whoever is sort of managing the staff beyond a departmental level is asking those kind of questions. Any other tips to kind of keep it on the front burner?
Yeah, and some of these 5 keys are going to kind of blend together. So I might cover these a little bit later, but one of our internship, the internship program, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we're constantly feeding the next generation of leaders in pretty much every department in every ministry. I would say a tip would be, depending on where you're at, is can you actually put in your schedule a time where you're going to talk about and even hold accountable the different departments within your church. And there's certain individuals, they just have natural leadership gifts where they're going to become developers of others. And that one of the things that I'll talk about again in a pipeline a little bit later is the higher level of responsibility that you have in your church. That's where the majority of your time should be spent developing, not just delegating tasks.
So we've talked about that first thing, is making sure you're developing staff and creating within them the mindset as well as the abilities to be able to develop others. Let's talk about sort of your second thing that's been key at Cedar Creek. And you start scouting for leaders earlier than any church I know. You start actually even in middle school. Tell us about how you start scouting for people with leadership potential through those younger years.
Yeah, a really cool story is obviously when you think about professional sports and college sports, they begin looking at middle school athletes, high school athletes, even though they're years away from qualifying to play in college or the pros. These professional teams, they know what they're looking for. And so we've kind of adopted that model as a church where all of our departments, we have 5 different campuses. So campus pastors, campus teams, as well as our central support ministry teams, they know the value of the next generation of leaders. So I send them an email in advance, about 3 months before we started our internship program, to say, who do you have your eye on that's catching your attention that could possibly be the future of our church? Now, middle school, you think about 6th, 7th grade, right? There are people in 6th and 7th grade who can lead, some of the kids in the kids ministries. When they move on to high school, the high school leaders and the experience they had in junior high, middle school, they could begin leading middle school groups as well. And we have what we call a senior leadership development program at our church, where these are high school seniors, and they take on the responsibility of leading small groups in high school, as well as leading just smaller groups of their students. And so they're already getting experience. And then 1 year after graduation of high school, then they qualify for our internship program. One of the cool stories, Brent, is a girl named Jasmine. She started going to Cedar Creek at age 10. So she went all the way through this system. She was an amazing middle school leader, leading the smaller kids. Same thing in high school. She was a senior leadership leader in that program. She became an intern and then an apprentice, and now she's on staff full time, leading in children's ministry. So that's one example of somebody that we spotted years ago. And right now, we have a person who's beginning the internship program. He was just selected, that began church at age 5. He was a 5-year-old when he started here. And so now he's going to be becoming an intern this coming fall.
That's a great perspective, Steve, of being a talent scout and looking for the next generation of people that potentially could be leaders in the church. There's a question someone has sort of asked us here is oftentimes staff can be a little protective of their roles, afraid if I develop someone, maybe they'll, there's no future for me here. How do you help your staff encourage them or incentivize them that raising up people and finding people that are younger leaders, even back to that middle school, high school example, is something that's rewarded rather than looked on as fearfully?
Well, here's what not to do. We used to say, hey, we want everybody to work themselves out of a job. Now think about that. If you're on the receiving end of that, it's not job security at all, right? So now we say, what we'd like for you to do is to multiply yourself into someone else, pass your skills on to someone else, because as you invest in someone else, you're going to personally grow in your own development. And plus, one of the things about about structure in any organization, there are limitations within an organization. So our staff understand the mission of the church isn't just within the walls of the church, but it's the entire world, the Great Commission. So we talk about investing in and raising up people who in turn is going to bless the world, not just Cedar Creek. So their job's secure.
And I'm sure, as I know, when people are great at developing others, that's the opportunities they get for more leadership and at Cedar Creek. And I think probably you're right, it's shifting the mentality of what's rewarded around here is the development of others rather than just your task getting done.
Exactly. Yep.
So you've talked a little bit about being talent scouts and looking for those middle school or high school kids that potentially could be the next generation of leaders for Cedar Creek. What are you looking for in them? What are the characteristics you're looking for them as you be a talent scout in the next generation?
Yeah, one of the things about now that we're a 22-year-old church, keep in mind that a lot of our current staff were once scouted. So they know what to look for. For example, we have probably over 35 of our staff have come through the internship program, have come within Cedar Creek, which is huge. Think about that. So we know what to look for. Here's what we look for. We look for people who can lead themselves well. Because if you can't lead yourself well, you won't be qualified to lead anybody else, whether it's a small group or a group of people or whatever. So we look for people who are self-led. They have that hunger to want to grow and learn. They've been really faithful in responsibilities they've been given. And so as our staff is observing those volunteers, even in school, what we're doing is we're providing opportunities for them to take on more and more responsibility. So they know what to look for because they were once that person themselves.
That's great. And how do you, is it you, Steve? I mean, or is it the culture? How do you create that mentality of we're trying to create the next generation of leaders as a vision? Because that's a vision you guys have.
It is. We've always had that. In fact, another great story, think about this. We just went through a transition, a succession plan with our church. So Lee, who I started the church with 22 years ago, he resigned due to an illness a year and a half ago. And so we have his replacement is 37-year-old, now senior pastor of Cedar Creek, Ben Snyder, who was a 19-year-old intern 18 years ago. So was that the question? That's just a really cool story.
That's amazing. So really, when you talk about your pathway or your into staff, comes through a lot through your internship program, but it also leads into the things that are funneling into things that are getting people ready for your internship. And that's sort of a good segue here into your third thing that's been key to creating this culture of the next generation in leadership, which is your internship program. Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about when you started it, and because you started it when you were a very small church. Yeah. And tell us how it's gone and what it looks like.
I'd say about 4 years into the start of Cedar Creek, we were attracting a lot of young people, and we wanted to put them on an intentional track to grow in their personal spiritual development as well as leadership. Because as a fast-growing church, we had holes to fill, and so but we wanted qualified people. So we began to hand select interns, maybe 3 or 4 at a time. Of course, Ben Snyder was one of those. And we started hand selecting 3 or 4 at a time that we would invest in for 1 year. It's a non-paid program. We ask people to raise support now. It's a 1-year program, and 80% of their internship is spent in the field of ministry. So they select a field of ministry, and then about 20% is spent in spiritual and leadership development. That's primarily what I focus on. We have a class every Tuesday night for 2 hours. We don't even talk about ministry, but we're all together talking about how to grow in our faith, our relationship with Christ, how to grow in our own personal leadership. And so we transitioned probably about 6 years ago. We went to a leadership network hub, a gathering, and there we learned the idea of actually opening up for applications for intern applicants, for interns. And at first I thought, well, my gosh, how can you control the quality? What if we get, wrong people applying? Well, that's when you got to start working on your selection criteria. What are the things you're looking for? And so once we started opening this up, we have about 12 to 14 interns per year that come on, and our selection process has gotten better and better. For example, this last 2 weeks ago, I got 26 applicants in for this next season. That's going to be starting. Of the 26 applicants, I did 17 interviews, and we're probably going to end up choosing between 10 and 12 of those. So that's kind of how it began. It's a 1-year program. They do raise support for that, and we're really looking again for those people who have a hunger. If you're familiar with Ideal Team Player, Patrick Lencioni, hungry, humble, smart. Our interview questions, we have weaved into those questions where we can identify the humble, the hungry, the smart part of that, because that's what we want to come in.
And so you have these guys and ladies, young ladies, come for a year. They get great input. How many hours a week are they spending with you in the internship program?
It can range anywhere from about 18 hours a week up to 28. And I say 28 because our labor laws in Ohio, if we have anybody working more than 28 hours in a particular field, we have to pay benefits. So 28 hours is the max for them.
So they have an input time, and they also can serve in multiple different areas. What are the areas they serve as interns in the church?
Yep, every area: arts, children's ministry, student ministry, graphics, administration. Pretty much every department we have an opening for.
And we've talked in the past that interns there are not there to do, as I would define, craft work.
You got it.
Significant work. How do you make sure that their experience of what they get to do is significant in forming them spiritually, as well as their passion for ministry? Yes.
Before an intern begins, they meet with their direct report, the person who's going to be shepherding and overseeing them during the course of the internship. It is laid out clear that we're not bringing them on to do tasks. They will do tasks, but we promise an experience to develop them spiritually and leadership, and also their skills. And so their direct report, their ministry direct report, realize that they're, unlike a key volunteer, they have to provide development into them by getting involved with their spiritual life. What are you learning? What are you reading? How can I help you grow your skills? All the interns they're treated like staff. They get to come to all of our staff meetings. And so the entire staff, whether they have an intern or not, treat these people like, man, thank you for being part of our team. You're the ones that's making Cedar Creek successful. So we make sure that we promise them an experience, not a job. And so we make it very, very clear that at the end of this season, we hope that God has given you clarity as far as, do you want to pursue ministry, or do you want to pursue a career path? And also, are you looking for ministry at Cedar Creek? Are you called to Cedar Creek or called to ministry? Because some people they just fall in love with the church. They don't ever want to leave. And unfortunately, we have this organizational capacity, only so many spots. We can't hire 12 people a year. So we tell them that, use your experience to maybe serve at another church or whatever. And we've had church planners out of this. Successful business people have come out of this. It's been great.
So are the interns pre-college, post-college? What are the age range in your internship program?
Our age range is age 19, which is basically 1 year out of high school, up to about 30. And it's a stage of life, because we don't want a person in their mid-30s leaving a full-time job with no guarantee and a family to support to begin an internship. So it's really a stage of life, 19 to about 30.
That's great. And what do you find is the biggest challenge you have about running an internship program for an existing church? Because obviously you've had to free up staff time towards this. You've had to what's the biggest challenges you have to overcome to keep a great internship program going in the momentum there?
Yeah, those challenges were greater in the beginning when, think about this, I'm going to give you a 20-hour-a-week person to develop. If that's the wrong person, that's going to drain that supervisor or that department. So one of the challenges we've overcome was making sure we're selecting the right people that's going to add value to that department. In other words, if somebody wants to be involved with the arts, we don't want to send them to learn how to play guitar. That's not the beginning. And so one of the challenges we've overcome was just making sure that we've got the right person in the right spot connected with the right direct report. Now, something else that's really important, Brent, is in the past, a lot of times the direct reports didn't know how to develop an intern. I mean, they're busy doing their job. So when we talk about leadership development, which goes back to that first point about making sure our people are developing, we realized we needed to provide training and resources on how to delegate, how to develop, how to give the appropriate feedback to make sure these people are advancing in their skills and their ministry. And so now, because we've had success in this, pretty much every department, they're scouting better, they know what to look for, and they realize that when they get an intern, they're going to get support primarily from me throughout the year.
That's great. And I think that's a good point you've made, where all these things tie together to create a culture. Right. And we're not talking about systems, because some ways an internship program can be a system, but if you don't have the culture that's scouting well, knowing what to look for, developing staff that are developing others, it's hard to do a great internship, because you've got to have the scouting and the people flowing into that. Well, let's talk about, this sort of leads into our fourth point here of what's been key in creating a leadership development rich culture for you guys. And that's creating a leadership development pathway and a pipeline. Yeah. And the language leadership pipeline has been around for a while, and the church is using it. Some people don't like the word. Some people like pathway or whatever. But tell us a little bit about how this has helped you guys in terms of creating this customized leadership development pathway.
Yeah, I think terminology is one of those things you got to be careful of. Nobody wants to be considered, I'm the third link in the pipeline. That's impersonal. But here's the idea. The leadership pipeline, just for a pathway, just for the sake of what we're talking about today, what this is about is helping a person to grow to the next level of leadership capacity that they have. John Maxwell talks about the law of the lid. Everyone has a lid, everyone has a capacity. There's the parable in the Bible, where the person went on a journey and he entrusted 5, 2, and 1 talent based on people's ability, right? And so all of our staff can identify where they're at on this pipeline. And so if you saw a picture, I think you saw a picture of our pipeline there, it all begins with leading yourself. Leading yourself qualifies you to lead others. Now, these aren't staff at this point, because this pipeline really begins across everyone in the church. Life group leaders, they're leading others. Life group coaches, they're leading life group leaders. And then they begin leading ministries, and then campuses, and then eventually churches. What we've done is we've taken each one of these levels has very specific characteristics and descriptions of what that level should be doing. What kind of tasks should they be doing? What kind of giftedness and responsibility should they be doing? Obviously, the higher up the pipeline, the higher up the responsibility that a person has in leading people, a lot less effort has to be given in task, and a lot more focus on development. So how do we ensure that happens? What I do is we have 5 campuses and then 3 other major segments of our ministries that have sub-ministries. So with these 8 groups of people, I rotate around on a regular basis, and I have a meeting with that team focusing on how to get better and increase their leadership lid. Now, some people, they find their sweet spot, and they can't, if you try to advance them, you're going to hurt them. You know what I'm saying? Some people are just wired at a certain level, and if you try to push them beyond that, they're going to choke out. But this is the important thing about the leadership pipeline, is that once you find your place, how God's gifted you and wired you. The big question is, how do you keep from burning out and getting bored in that spot if you're not going to really go much higher up the pipeline, just for practical purposes here?
Steve,
I was just going to say, what we say is that wherever you're at in that level of pipeline, you should be looking at the level coming behind you to see how can you help them improve. So everyone should be owning the responsibility of, hey, just because I've identified myself as a 4th level leader in this organization, maybe I can become a 5th level leader. But the thing is, I have a responsibility, because we're a team, to help develop people in our organization to at least get to what I'm doing. And that's the mindset we're trying to create, the culture.
And Steve, one of the things we talk about when we talk is that everybody's leadership pathway or pipeline really needs to be customized, because kind of the skills and characteristics you're leading at each level of the pipeline, given what your vision is a little bit different. And tell us just a little bit of the process of, how you designed that.
Okay, what was the question? I mean, just as far as how do we actually do it?
Like how did you figure out what you needed at each level of the pipeline? What were the characteristics of each level of the pipeline?
Well, I'll tell you one way we figured it out was over the course of many years of listening to people a lot smarter than us. I remember sitting at a leadership network. There was one of the gatherings we were at. Mark Miller was there talking about the pipeline at Chick-fil-A. And I got to spend a half a day with this guy, and I just learned so much. And so I think learning from others just how to build a successful pathway, a method of moving people forward. A pipeline is simply a system to get a product from one location to a desired location. It's constant movement. And Chick-fil-A figured this out. And so we took their pipeline idea and created what we thought would fit within the organization of Cedar Creek. So with us, it's 6 levels. Other churches might have 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever. But we learned these things from from people who had been doing this trial and error even in the corporate world.
So let me ask you a question. Let's imagine I was in your pipeline. I'm a leader. I'm leading others, and you want me to move to leading leaders, that kind of thing. And you see potential in me.
Yep.
Put me in that role. Do I move up to that role of coach, leader of leaders, and then you train me, or you train me first? How do you get me ready to make that kind of move in the pipeline?
That's a great question. And what we've done is we've actually gotten really practical with this, saying that, you know what, I think, and this isn't a science, but I would guess 80% of growing in a field is just by experience. You're going to learn as you go. But I'd say 20% of that probably has to be learned. It's almost like classroom learning. How to increase your people skills, how to properly delegate and follow up. And so what I would do with you, Brent, is that I would say, if I see you have the potential to become a level 3 leader, there are certain lessons that we've created. We have a resource page on our pipeline for every level that has all kinds of studies, lessons, and books that's appropriate for that level. So what I would do is I'd say, Brent, let's take some time. Let's go through this book together, because I think this is going to help identify the best next step for you to get to the level that you want to go to. And there's also some lessons by John Maxwell. Some of you are familiar with, I think most are familiar with John Maxwell. He has a ministry called Equip. I was actually an associate trainer for John for 3.5 years to a lot of the persecuted church leaders, and access to his training materials they're all leadership lessons. And what we've done was we've taken all these lessons and have separated them by level. This is the best lesson for this level of leadership. So Brent, I would just work with you, or I'd work with a team of you, not you one-on-one, but I'd probably get a half a dozen of you in a room together to say, hey, let's focus on this for the next 6 months and see where God takes it.
So your pipeline basically has then resources for each level along the way, so your staff know here are the resources we use to develop people in those turns in your pipeline.
Yep, right.
And let me ask you another question: is how do you guys are a church of 8,000. You have 5 campuses. How do you keep track of like who's at what level and who's ready to take a turn? Like, how do you manage the complexity that obviously you face in developing people through your pathway?
Yeah, well, fortunately we have, our church is divided into separate ministries. And so each ministry department is primarily the ones that's looking at who's ready to go to the next level. And I will say this too, is that we will shift people from one campus to another and even one ministry to another, depending on their strengths and gifts. So I think that part of our culture that we have is that everyone is looking for that next best person to move to a spot that's needed. And some of us might not be aware of it. I can't be at all the campuses all week long. We have 100 staff and 8 major ministries. And so I'm depending upon the campus pastors and their teams and the direct reports, ministry leaders, the executive pastors to be doing some shoulder tapping. Say, hey, I think you'd be great to kind of come on board and volunteer in this area to learn some skills and things.
And what we've sort of intuitively talked about here is your pipeline is not just for staff. It's for volunteers, unpaid leaders.
Oh, yeah.
This is for everybody, not just your staff. We
have a lot of people at our churches. If we didn't have volunteers leading certain volunteer ministries every single weekend, we could not function. A lot of these volunteers are the ones that are invited into an internship program, but keep in mind, the internship program is 19 to 30. We got 40, 50-year-olds at our church that are knocking it out of the park in their leadership, because think about this, they have life experience. Some of them have great business skills experience that's very valuable for our church. So we'll put them in his pipeline and say, you know what, we'd love to have you teach this group of people how to become better, take next steps, life groups, small group leaders, ushers, greeters, things like that. So we have leadership teams all throughout our church.
That's great. And I think what we've talked about here is you have a vision of creating a church like leaders for the next generation of the church. And that's kind of, that vision has driven into your culture. And I think oftentimes people, when they try and put their pipeline in place, they haven't figured out the why. Like what's our narrative that's driving why we want to develop leaders. And tell us a little bit about how that fuels all of this for you, rather than it's just a system we run.
Yeah, we know that not everyone's going to stay forever. People are going to move on for different reasons. We're going through a senior leadership change. Lee Powell just left. I know it's hard to believe, everybody, but I'm in my 60s, And so there's going to come a day when I am going to be looking for my replacement. And in fact, our church is going to be going through transition, and churches all across America are going through transition. Sometimes it's planned, sometimes unplanned. We say we have got to build that bench. And if we wait until there's a need, what we're going to do is we're going to put the wrong person in the wrong spot at the wrong time and ruin that person plus everybody around them, right? So the fuels everything, Brent, is just building that bench for the future so that when an opportunity comes up, and we have a lot of them in our church, we're ready. We're ready to move people so we don't have to go out and put an ad in the paper and hire someone from the outside. We're ready to put together people that know us, they love us, and they represent us well.
Someone's used the analogy one time is, do you want to be the New York Yankees or the St. Louis Cardinals?
Ooh, I'm glad you didn't say Kansas City. That's my hometown, careful. You got close. You got close.
The Yankees are always trying to buy talent when they need it. Yeah. Where the Cardinals have this great pipeline of a minor league system that's creating that bench strength, so that if someone leaves as a free agent, you've got all these people, these guys ready to come.
That's what it's all about. Yeah, we had the Toledo Mud Hens in Toledo, and of course they feed Detroit Tigers. And it's fun. It's fun to watch that. It's fun to watch the transition. It's really cool.
The last point we're going to talk about here in your 5th one about what's kind of allowed you guys to create this great culture of developing so many leaders, so many people for ministry, so many people making impacts in the marketplace, is your 5th one is have someone who owns leadership development. Yeah. And for you guys, that's you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Brent, we learned it. We learned it from networking with other great churches through Leadership Network. That's where I started first hearing about that. Someone has to own it. All of us would say, oh yeah, we believe in leadership development. We know that it's important to develop people, but you know what? We are so busy. It happens organically or accidentally, and it wasn't planned. So about 3 years ago, it was my primary responsibility to make sure I wake up every day and I'm thinking about the next generation of leaders, our current generation of staff leaders. How do we keep everybody fresh, forward thinking, and buying into the 2 Timothy 2:2 principle? The things that we've heard and learned, we're going to teach others who will teach others. I think Cedar Creek is going to be a church that's going to be around long after I'm gone, next 50 years plus. And so someone had to step up and say, actually it wasn't me volunteering. Our leadership team together said, we got to pay attention to this and make sure it doesn't happen accidentally in an emergency. And so when I wake up in the morning, I'm thinking about the staff. Where are you in your personal development? Have you taken time to grow yourself? Because you're killing yourself cranking out your great task every week, but are you taking time to grow yourself? If I wasn't reminding them of that, if I wasn't reminding the executive pastors to be doing that with their team, it may happen, but the whole idea is intentionality and to ensure that it's happening, accountability.
I often talk about the two things in a church that create culture around leadership development, the two golden bullets, so to speak, that help a culture of leadership development work. Is the first one is answering the why question. Yeah. Why do we develop leaders? What's our driving narrative that drives us towards leadership development? And for you guys, it's that next generation of leaders. And the second thing is having someone who wakes up every day thinking about it and because leadership development never screams the same way something else does. And was that a tough call for you as a leadership to kind of free you up from all your other executive functions to have someone at the senior leadership team waking up every day thinking about leadership development?
You know what? It was we saw the necessity of it. I used to oversee the campus pastors, keeping all that together. And another one of our executive pastors does that now. So we saw the need of that. And I think what really drives it, Brent, is because our church is so focused on helping, people discover, find, fall in love with Jesus. We understand the Great Commission. The world is big. It's bigger than Toledo, Ohio. And what we say is that if we can raise up, even if our best people, if our best person came to us and said, you know what, I feel a calling to wherever, we wouldn't choke. We wouldn't panic. We'd think, you know what, first of all, God, thank you for giving us the opportunity to be a part of this person's life and to release them, because all along we've been raising up a bench behind them. And so I would say that this has always been part of who we are. And for me to take on that particular role, it was welcomed. It was we all agreed to it. We've made adjustments for it, and the Great Commission drives the whole thing.
A couple of other questions that we'll have time for today is, someone's asked the question, what are the advantages of this philosophy of hiring from within versus hiring from outside? And what benefit have you seen that to your ministry there at the church? Well,
every church has its own DNA. Every church has its own culture. And you know what it's like to go to someone else's family's Thanksgiving dinner? You ever been that person where you're invited to someone's family? You're welcome and everyone's friendly, but there's just not that fit. You don't get the inside jokes like the rest of the family does, right? And so what we say is the huge advantage is that these are people, number one, you've observed. You're not taking a chance of guessing, well, the resume says they're the superstars. Everyone's resume says they're superstars, right? But you've observed them in good times, bad times. You watch them struggle and you watch them become faithful or fall. And so the advantage is that you know what you're getting. For the most part, you know what you're getting when you place them in certain roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, it certainly keeps surprise. It was funny. I was talking with a church recently who said, we hire a lot from the outside, and we're trying to shift that. I said, why is that? He said, well, everybody agrees with our vision in the interview. Everyone believes in our culture in the interview. Everyone believes in our operating principles in the interview. And then when we get them on the job, we find, maybe I don't. So when you know that, when you hire both in, you already know that, don't you?
You do. And I'll tell you something else, Brent, is that I said everyone's resume looks good, but think about this too. If you agree with 80% of our theology, right? Just our doctrine, basic doctrine, 20%, you might say, well, I'll tolerate it. That's going to cause a problem eventually, especially when there's some kind of you got a college student leading a high school group, and we're teaching them one thing, but he has a different philosophy. Man, that is a train wreck. That's dangerous. But I would say that we'll never say that we won't hire from the outside. We might, because there's other churches that we network with that we trust, and when certain people recommend someone, we're going to pay attention to that. But so far, we believe everyone we need is already sitting in our seats. And if you're a church of 500, they're sitting there, because chances are you're not going to need 100 of them. You're going to need 5 or 6 of them, right? And so they're already sitting out there. So ask your team, ask those in responsibility, hey, who have you observed and recognized they're on time, they're hungry, they're humble, they're smart in how they deal with people? Let's tap them on the shoulder and see if they'd like to have an opportunity.
That's great. So let me ask you a question. You're a church of 8,000. You wake up every day thinking about leadership development. Probably most churches on our webinar today are probably not going to be able to start with just let's find a Steve.
Absolutely. You don't have payroll for that.
And history and context and those kind of things is.
Right.
How do you? Where would you start? How would you start having that person as a point? I would call them a champion for leadership development. If you are at a church of 500 to 1,000, where do you start?
Yeah, it's going to be a shared responsibility. In other words, whatever your job description is, see if you can add that to the job description. What that might require is maybe you're going to devote maybe 10 hours of your week. That's maybe a day of your week to where you're just going to be thinking about names you're going to write down. You're going to think about how to get them on a track of development and growth. Even starting an internship program, I would handpick 3 or 4 people that you're just going to invest into on a weekly basis. Handpick a few ministries where the ministry team leader is going to do a good job developing them, and to say, let's just test this thing. So I'm going to invite you into a leadership development opportunity for maybe 3 to 6 months, and then we'll evaluate it, see how it goes. And if someone could just put that as part of their job description, just to get that part going alone, that's where it all begins. So you don't go out and hire a full-time leadership development person. What you do is have someone who already has that leadership eye and giftedness to say, hey, would you mind starting to pay a little bit more attention to how we can start moving people in their advancement and also building our bench? That's where it starts.
That's great. Well, let's kind of review what we've talked about today, Steve, because you and I can go back and forth for hours on this.
Oh, yeah.
The number one principle you had was you need to prioritize your staff development, helping them become developers of others, equipping them, holding them accountable, working with your staff to become 2 Timothy 2:2 kind of people. We've talked about starting to scout for leaders and knowing what you're looking for as you scout for leaders, even back into the middle school. You guys have talked about your internship program being key as a feeder system for that. You've talked about kind of having a clear pathway so that as you're building people, you've figured out the turns in the pipeline and what those look like, and having someone who wakes up every day being the champion for leadership development at Cedar Creek. And you guys have done a fabulous job. You've got you've raised up, 97 of your staff have been raised up from within. You've planted churches, you've multiplied people in the community. And so thank you for sharing a little bit about your culture of what's worked. And we're going to just turn over for the last couple of minutes back to Tim Nations.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks, Steve. I do want to mention a couple things about resources that we have for you and also some options. Steve mentioned the experience that Cedar Creek was a part of several years ago that really helped them to formulate the pipeline and help take steps toward developing that culture specifically for their church. As many of you know, Leadership Network has spent more than 25 years working with some of the most innovative and influential churches in the world across a variety of topics. And one of the things that we've learned in doing that is there's, a single shot in the arm won't bring about the change that churches need to move to the next level, especially in an area such as leadership development. You need more than that. And so for some of you, the answer to that might be our Hub experience. And here's how Hub is different. Hub is a 3-gathering, 12-month experience for teams that puts you on a journey with other creative teams, with recognized experts, just like Mark Miller and some others that were alluded to before, and also the Leadership Network team that addresses the challenges and opportunities for your church. Hub is about helping you achieve progress over time. So we don't just throw ideas at you and send you on your way. We really walk alongside you and your team as you explore new ideas and models, as you gain insights into the needs of your church, and you identify and prioritize next steps for positive change. Hub Leadership Development specifically helps you to create action plans and measure results around 3 critical areas of leadership development. Developing that customized model that's unique to your church. Building a reproducing culture that's critical to healthy leadership development. And designing a robust pipeline or pathway, which is the foundational component of any reproducing church. One of the things that we say is that Hub isn't for everyone. In fact, we take teams through an application and an interview process just to ensure we have the right mix of teams in the room to give everyone the best experience possible. But the first step in exploring Hub is to take some time and talk with Brent on the phone about your model of leadership development and whether or not Hub might be a good fit for you. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to follow up with an email that's going to give you a few different things. One, it's going to give you access to 2 additional resources on leadership development. One is a resource called The 10 Truths of Churches That Do a Great Job with Leadership Development. It's a free PDF download. It captures some of the best thinking on leadership development in the church today. The second one is a recording of our previous webinar with John Ferguson, co-founder of Community Christian Church in Chicagoland. In our last webinar, Brent and John talk about how they identify, develop, and retain leaders at Community Christian. Now, you'll also receive a follow-up email with details on how to get those resources and also how to get in touch with Brent to set up a 20-minute phone call to see if Hub might be a fit for you and your team. So keep an eye on your inbox. We have some great stuff headed your way. And on behalf of the Leadership Network team, I want to just thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next time.